Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 14th of November, where we are putting some closure onto Dracula. And if you'll note in the notes below, there are going to be some changes to the due dates. The Dracula journal, which was going to be due today, and certainly you can hand it in if you'd like, I've extended that until the 16th on Wednesday because I wanted to talk about Dracula today and also finish up with some quotes from Dracula next class, which also means that I'm going to be extending the Lovecraft journal. So now that'll be extended to the 23rd on Wednesday. Initially, it was scheduled for the 21st. Of course, you can always hand in journals early, but this gives us a little bit more time to talk about these texts. And in terms of paper number one, if you had returned paper number one to me, or if you had submitted, I should say, paper number one to me on time, I should have returned it back to you. So if you submitted it in on time and you haven't received it yet, please let me know. And as you know, with paper number one, you all have the option of revising it for a higher grade. So unlike the journals, which I evaluated just for content, I evaluated the first paper also for grammar and mechanics in addition to content. And rather than just putting a check mark grade on it, the way I would have done with journals, I am putting a letter grade on it and with some summary commentary about suggestions about how to proceed in the future or how to proceed with the revision. It's up to you to decide whether or not you want to revise the paper, although occasionally I might instruct you to revise the paper if it turns out that your paper is very different from what the expectations were for this particular assignment, which is a critical paper, if you'll remember. So I'm not necessarily asking for outside resources. That said, if you do use outside resources, you definitely want to document those sources. But the critical paper is your analysis of a particular text, and the focus would probably be either on Frankenstein or Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, or Edgar Allan Poe. And the second paper is going to be very similar to the first paper. The first paper being approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it would need to be, where it would focus on a thesis or one particular element of the text, something that reasonable people could disagree about, a position that you would be taking, that you would defend through paraphrase and also use of quotation from the text itself. And that said, if you still aren't quite certain how to proceed with the revision, if you would like to pursue that option, please feel free to reach out to me. But basically what I'm asking you for the revision is to take my comments into account and to do a rewrite and submit in the original copy with my comments along with your revision. You would get the higher of the 2 grades. And you have up until the ending of the semester in which to do that, but ultimately the sooner that you can do that, the better off you are. You'll remember that in the syllabus, I had talked a little bit about paper grading and some of the ways that we could distinguish an A paper from a B paper from a C paper. And just to quickly review that, the A paper, or excellent, develops a clear central idea with originality and depth of thought and displays a consistent sense of audience. Its topic is developed with clear and logical supporting ideas. The organization is sound. Each paragraph has a core idea, supported by fitting examples and illustrations. Paragraphs are joined to those following and those before with smooth links. Sentences are well put together and varied, and the paper is generally free of common errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Now, a B paper or a good paper has a clearly stated central idea, but it lacks the energy or depth of thought of an A. It draws safe conclusions. The topic is interesting, focused adequately, and logically developed, however. Organization is correct and logical, but sometimes it strains a bit. Each paragraph has a central idea, examples or illustrations, and a logical point. And some of the transitions between paragraphs are smooth, some are not. Sentences tend to have little variety in structure, and the paper is largely free of common errors in grammar, spelling, and punctuation. And then The C paper. The C paper has a reasonably clear central idea and shows adequate grasp of the reason for the assignment, such as direction, description, persuasion, but focus is blurred in some places. The development with examples or the illustrations can be sketchy in some places. Organization is not altogether clear. Most paragraphs have a sense of organization, but development is vague. Transitions between paragraphs can be awkward or even lacking. And there are some patterns of mistakes at this point in grammar, spelling, and punctuation. And then the D paper, which is less than satisfactory, since the C is satisfactory. The D paper does not state or develop a central idea, though the pattern shows that the writer has some central concept. The sense of audience tends to be inconsistent. The organization is hard to follow, and frequently paragraphs seem to lack a central idea. Transitions between paragraphs are scanty, even absent. Sentences are awkwardly or incorrectly constructed. The writing does not indicate college level proficiency, and there are frequent errors now in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Or the F paper and the unsatisfactory. It states no central idea, has no connection to a single topic. The writing is contradictory, characterized by many apparent changes of subject. No evidence of overall editing or writing beyond a first draft stage is evident. Most sentences have errors in construction. Paragraphing is haphazard or non-existent, and there are many errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Again, occasionally I might put a no grade on the paper where I would direct you to reconstruct the paper following my criteria that I would have indicated in that particular paper. So in terms of the paper, again, feel free to reach out to me if you've got any questions or concerns. The idea behind the second paper, which will be due at the very ending of the semester, is that you would have already incorporated the concepts of writing the first paper successfully so that you could address them in the second paper. However, if you can get in the second paper early enough, I have had students be able to negotiate a revision. It is not a guaranteed thing. Obviously, a lot comes in at the ending of the semester, so it would depend on timing. But again, everybody has the option of revising the first paper for a higher grade. I'm assuming that an A paper wouldn't want to be, or an A paper wouldn't need to be revised. You really couldn't earn over an A, but anything after that is a possibility for revision. So, moving back to Dracula, what I wanted to do was to talk about what I call Book 3, which is Mina's Mystery. Remember, I had talked about how Dracula is perhaps the most challenging text of the semester just because of its sheer length. So trying to divide it up into pieces, and the first section, which I call basically the supernatural section, and this is where we learn about the vampire and Dracula. And then the second section, which is more of a romance that goes on with the characters of Lucy and Mina, and basically we learn how both of them are new women, but in very different kinds of senses. Mina is somewhat independent and has embraced technology, but she also is very loyal to Jonathan and the Victorian standards that exist in society, as opposed to Lucy, who I suggested could be considered somewhat loose in her morals as she contemplates 3 engagements at the same time. And I don't think it's any mistake that it's Lucy's character who is killed in the novel, not Mina's character. I hope by this point I'm not giving away any spoilers, because you should have finished Dracula by this particular point. What we see in chapter 17, or what I call Mina's Mystery, the third section of the book, which turns into a kind of mystery novel, which again I think is quite clever of Stoker, giving us all of these different kinds of genres. So we begin with supernatural, then we move with romance, then we go to mystery, and we end with action adventure, so that it can appeal to the widest level of audience possible. We see how Mina is very much a researcher as she's compiling evidence. Again, she is very unusual for the time for female because of her ability to reason and rationalize. The characters talk about how they get to know one another through technology, which might seem kind of odd unless you think about our current times. So, in some ways, Stoker was ahead of his time because so many of us now form relationships through and solely by technology. And one quote that I wanted to reference, though I'll be referencing multiple quotes next class: we women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters. The idea of gender is particularly interesting in Dracula, in that ultimately what we have is a text that takes place in very repressive Victorian England, but it also examines the idea of a new world order, which I think we begin to see as the novel progresses. In chapter 18, their scriptural phrase, for the blood is the life, I think is quite important in terms of our understanding how Christianity is portrayed as savior. So that said, I think that we will find many Christian analogies within the text. And this idea that blood gives life is something that I had also talked about in the context of perhaps the first serial killer, Countess Bathory, who killed her victims and bathed in their blood in order to retain eternal youth. Van Helsing says tellingly about Mina that she has a man's brain, but a woman's heart. The idea is that she's able to meld both of the best qualities of both genders. On page 243 to 246, at least in the version that I had assigned for class, we get the vampire lore, which I'll be talking about next class. And ask just about any person, and they'll probably go through several elements of vampire lore, even if they've never read Dracula. It's become that important in terms of popular culture that all of us have some sort of general understanding of vampire lore, much of it established first through this text, Dracula. And Quincy Morris, who represents the New America, shoots a vampire bat. There's some foreshadowing here about vampires and how Quincy is going to respond to the threat as the novel progresses. It also shows that Quincy, and perhaps Americans as a whole, tend to be rather rash. I don't think it's any surprise that Quincy also dies in the novel, the American, the outsider, the other, something that we've seen in other Gothic texts. Chapter 19 takes place in October, rather fitting when we think about all of the associations with the fall. And this will be the fall, obviously, of Dracula. And of course, all of the supernatural elements associated with Halloween. We learn a little bit about how Renfield continues to consume flies and even moves to spiders as he's moving to higher level life forms. And this is part of what Stephen King would call in Danse Macabre the gross out. That's one of the functions Renfield serves, as well as a symbolic function for trying to consume life. And the men isolate Mina in chapter 19. And we always know that isolation is a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. And their actions are downright stupid, considering how they talk about Mina's usefulness and her ability to reason. If they hadn't have isolated her, she wouldn't have been vulnerable to Dracula's attacks. Chapter 20, suspicious Dracula now is going after Renfield. And in chapter 21, we see Quincy rashly chasing the vampire, and Mina drinking Dracula's blood as opposed to Dracula drinking Mina's blood. Now, this is a role reversal, an interesting role reversal in terms of male and female. It also is a great plot device, allowing Mina to be able to see into Dracula's mind, which is going to be necessary as the novel progresses. Think about all of the sexual possibilities as well with the idea of sucking, as we will discuss with some of the quotations next class. And then we get to what I call the very ending of Dracula, the adventure novel, and that is what I call book 4. In chapter 22, Jonathan vows to join Mina as a vampire. He's being quite gallant, saying that he will basically embrace a life of evil if that means that he can remain with Mina. Again, a touch of romance there, perhaps. I've mentioned previously about how I've always appreciated the puns in this text. For instance, in chapter 23, when they're talking about there's more at stake. Of course, the stake is such an essential part of vampire lore in terms of how to kill a vampire. I had also suggested that the stake can work as a kind of phallic symbol. Stephen King also talked about this as well in Danse Macabre. When Lucy is being staked to death, it almost seems orgasmic. In chapter 24, Mina says something telling. You men are brave and strong, but I may be of service. And of course, as I had just suggested, it's because she's excluded that ultimately she becomes vulnerable. Chapter 25, where Mina talks a little bit about the Count being a criminal and a criminal type. Chapter 26, a small point, but I think again an important one. When Quincy Morris is left behind to watch Mina because he's the only one who doesn't speak more than one language. So he's not as useful as some of the others. And of course, it's the American who can speak just one language, his own. So I don't know if you've heard the old joke of what do you call somebody who's trilingual, can speak 3 languages? What do you call somebody who is bilingual? They speak 2 languages. And what do you call somebody who speaks 1 language? And that's American. But at any rate, again, I think there are little digs in America here, this being a British text, especially when Quincy dies to save Mina. Very heroic. But again, the 2 characters that die, Mina and Lucy, are the ones that are considered to be outsiders, at least within the group of major players trying to defeat Dracula. At the ending, we do get a happy ending. Jonathan and Mina's son is born on the anniversary of Quincy's death, no less, and he basically has a mixture of all of the names of all of their party. And there is the acknowledgement that there are no true, authentic documents to prove the events that have happened. And as we've talked about with the Gothic, it's so important that we have this sense of ambiguity. Dracula is perhaps our most supernatural text that we've read this semester, but yet even Dracula has an element of ambiguity to it at the ending when there's acknowledgement that outside of journal entries and a few newspaper clippings and some letters, there really is no concrete evidence to prove that the events happened. So if you wanted to embrace a theory such as group hysteria, something that we'll be talking about actually when we talk about The Haunting, our ghost story that's coming up soon, you could. Now, do note in section 3 of the notes for Dracula, I have something, or a website I have listed that's called Dracula Daily. So that's something that you might be interested in, where you can sign up for this website, and basically you can get the novel Dracula sent to you via email based on the dates in which the entries occur in the novel. So you can go through the entire novel over a year. Obviously, we don't have the time to do something like that, but what a wonderful way to experience Dracula in real time, so to speak. And as I indicated, next class, what I wanted to do was to talk about some Dracula quotes and also to finally move us forward to our next author. And that happens to be H.P. Lovecraft. And you'll remember that we talked about H.P. Lovecraft at the beginning of the semester when we talked about supernatural horror and literature. We also talked about what a big fan Lovecraft was of Poe and why. And we've read some of Poe, so perhaps now we have an understanding of why Lovecraft thought so highly of Poe. But I wanted us to read some of Lovecraft's short stories, only 3, just to see if Lovecraft lives up to what he himself argues are elements of great supernatural literature. The 3 stories that I chose are short stories, one entitled The Outsider, and if you are using the text that I had assigned for class, that's on pages 27 through 32. Pickman's Model, which is on pages 33 through 44. And lastly, The Dunwich Whore, and that's on pages 98 to 135. That's the longest one. You'll note that in our 6th section in the notes below, I've included web links for those 3 stories in the event that you don't have a hard copy of the text. There also is a copy on reserve in the GCC library. And you'll also see in the notes below that I've included a flyer for my horror film class, so that if it turns out you're interested in knowing what films we will be talking about during the semester, you can see that. So what's left is our attendance question, which will be due on the 16th, Wednesday at 8 a.m. And again, if you need an extension, please let me know. And again, you're not required necessarily to respond to your classmates. They'll certainly do so if you're moved to do so, but you are required to read your classmates' responses. What have you found to be the most surprising element about the novel Dracula, and why? What did you find to be the most surprising element about the novel Dracula, and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will go through some Dracula quotes next class and move forward to H.P. Lovecraft. And for those of you who want to get a head start, after H.P. Lovecraft, we are doing The Haunting by Shirley Jackson. Take care. Bye-bye.